3 deeds were spread across my kitchen table at midnight, and every one of them had the same name in the buyer's box. The Garrisons, 4 doors down, sold last spring. The Patels, on the corner, the winter before. Old Doc Whitman, who'd lived here since the streets were dirt, gone the year before that. 3 families, 3 voluntary sales after 2 years of the association burying each of them in daily fines, and 3 deeds transferring to the exact same faceless buyer, Cedar Hollow Holdings, LLC. And sitting on top of the stack, fresh from my own mailbox that afternoon, was my 4th notice in 3 weeks, a daily accruing fine, now at $900 for the color of my mulch. My name is Nathan Reed. I was 46 that year, and I am a certified fraud examiner. I spent 15 years as a forensic analyst unwinding exactly this kind of thing for a bank. Money that moves in a pattern while everyone insists it's a coincidence. 3 houses, 1 buyer, and me, next on a list they had, very unwisely, mailed to a man who reads patterns for a living. I didn't panic. I got a legal pad and started drawing. Here is the thing about people who run a scheme for 2 years without getting caught. They get sloppy, because nobody's ever made them nervous. So the first thing I did, before I answered a single fine, was pull the full deed chain on all 3 sales from the county recorder. And then I looked up Cedar Hollow Holdings itself. The LLC's registered agent traced to a mailbox in a UPS store on Route 9. The same UPS store, suite number and all, listed as the correspondence address for Meridian Community Management, the company the board paid to run Cedar Hollow. A buyer and the association's own management company sharing a mailbox is not a coincidence. It's a fingerprint. I scanned every page, time-stamped every file, and started a link chart on the wall of my office the way I used to build them for a grand jury. Fines on the left, a lien in the middle, a lowball sale on the right, and an arrow from all 3 pointing at one LLC that lived in the manager's mailbox. Then I sat back and looked at it, and I felt that old flat calm, the one that used to settle over me right before a case cracked open. I answered the fines the way a fraud examiner answers anything, which is in writing and with a records request. I sent a certified demand under the state's association transparency law for the fining committee's minutes, the collection policy, and every contract the board held. And I disputed the mulch fine with a photograph of the approved materials list that included my exact mulch. What came back was not a correction. It was a second citation for a trash can visible from the street, and a doubling of the daily rate, and a note that continued, non-compliance would be referred for a lien. And at the open board meeting that week, when I stood up and asked, politely, why my fines had tripled during an active dispute, Gary Voss, 54, vice president of the board and chairman of the compliance committee, leaned back in his chair, smiled at the room, and said the sentence I would eventually play back to a prosecutor. Some folks just aren't a fit for Cedar Hollow, Mr. Reed. The neighborhood sorts itself out. The room chuckled. I wrote it down word for word, because a man who tells you out loud that he sorts out the neighbors he doesn't like has just described a motive, and motive is the hardest thing to prove and the easiest thing to hand someone for free. The next 2 weeks were a knife fight conducted entirely on paper, and Gary swung first and often. A compliance officer started appearing at my curb every morning, photographing my house, my truck, my hose, generating a fresh violation before I'd finished coffee. The lien threat became a filed lien. A friendly real estate agent I'd never met left a card in my door offering a fast, discreet cash sale, no repairs needed, which was a remarkable coincidence of timing for a man who'd just been buried in fines. So I stopped playing defense and started digging into the machine itself. I pulled the appraisals from the 3 prior sales, and there he was in every one, an independent appraiser named Ray Dolan, who had valued 3 perfectly good houses at figures a fraud analyst would describe, in technical terms, as a joke. Each one low. Each one just under a threshold. Each one feeding a discounted sale to Cedar Hollow Holdings. The same appraiser, the same buyer, the same committee running the fines. And when I chased the ownership of the LLC through the state filings, past the nominee whose name was on the paperwork, the beneficial interest led, through one thin shell, back to Gary Voss. This was not a strict board. This was a flip ring. Fine a homeowner into distress. Have your own appraiser lowball the house. Buy it cheap through an LLC that lives in your manager's mailbox and resell it at market. Gary wasn't enforcing rules. He was harvesting houses. The ring could feel me getting close, and it answered the way bullies always do, by trying to make the pressure physical. On a Thursday, a tow truck with a magnetic sign rolled up my driveway to haul off my work trailer. Dispatched, the driver said, by the HOA over an unregistered vehicle violation. My trailer, parked on my own concrete, registered and current. I didn't argue with the driver, and I didn't touch the truck. I stood on my own property, filmed the plate and the hookup, and called the sheriff to report an attempted theft from private property. And I watched the driver decide very quickly that his day rate did not cover felonies and dropped the hitch. Gary Voss came down to the curb to supervise and made the mistake of stepping in front of my camera, telling me I could make all of this stop with one phone call to that realtor. A deputy arrived, read my registration and my deed, and told Gary that a man's own trailer on his own driveway was not the association's to tow. Gary stood at my curb and watched a second stranger in a uniform explain his own overreach back to him. And I thanked the deputy and went back inside to my wall of arrows, because every threat they mailed me was just one more box on the chart. With the whole scheme finally mapped on my office wall, I went to find the one thing a link chart can't give you, which is a human being who lived it. Doc Whitman had moved to his daughter's place 2 counties over, and I drove out and sat on his porch. And the old man's face changed the second I said the words, Cedar Hollow Holdings. He'd kept everything. Every fine escalating exactly like mine, for things like a faded mailbox and a wind chime, until the lien and the pressure and the helpful cash offer wore him down and he sold to make it stop, for tens of thousands under what the house was worth. He'd never known there was a pattern. He just thought he was old and unlucky. I told him he wasn't unlucky. He was harvested. And I watched a decent man realize he'd been robbed by the same people who mailed him a newsletter about community values. He gave me his whole file and his word that he'd say all of it to anyone who'd listen. I now had a living witness, and a witness changes everything. Doc was the first I found, but he wasn't the last. Armed with his file and the deed chain, I tracked down the Garrisons in the next town and the Patels 2 exits up the interstate, and I sat at both their kitchen tables and laid the same 3 deeds in front of them. Neither family had ever known. Both had spent a year believing they'd simply been unlucky, worn down by a board that fined them for shutters and gutters and a garden gnome until selling was the only way left to breathe. But when I showed them the single buyer's name, the single appraiser, and the mailbox on Route 9, the Garrisons' kitchen went very quiet, and then Mr. Garrison asked the question I'd been hoping someone would ask. Can we get our house back? I told him that depended entirely on how loud we were willing to be, and that I intended to be very loud. By the end of that week, I didn't have one angry man with a legal pad. I had 3 families, a stack of fine letters that matched line for line, and a shared reason to walk into a room together. The ring felt me getting close, because they always do, and here is where they made the mistake that finished them. They tried to buy my silence. Todd Kane, the Meridian manager whose mailbox the LLC shared, requested a private meeting and, across a coffee shop table, made me an offer. The board would waive every fine, release the lien, and Cedar Hollow Holdings would purchase my home at a generous above-appraisal price if I would sign a confidentiality agreement and let the whole thing drop. I said I'd need to think about it, and I let him talk, and I let my phone, sitting face up between us with the notice of recording I'm legally required to give in this state, captured Todd Kane explaining that the fines were just leverage and that Gary likes to have the number set before the appraisal comes in. Set before the appraisal comes in. He had just told me, on the record, that the price was rigged before the house was even valued, which is the entire crime in one sentence. Then Todd did the thing frightened middlemen do when they realize whose name is on the filings and whose isn't. He got scared for himself, and a week later he called me back, not to close the deal, but to hand me the inside of the machine. The internal spreadsheet of target addresses ranked by how close each owner was to breaking, the emails where Gary directed Dolan's valuations, and the escrow records tying the resales to Gary's nominee. Todd had decided he was not going to prison alone for a man who'd never once put his own name on a document, and he gave me the whole ledger. Now I had all of it, and this is the part where you might expect me to say I filed a lawsuit. I didn't, because a lawsuit is slow and private, and these people had spent 2 years harvesting my neighbors in the dark, and a crime that organized doesn't get answered with a quiet civil complaint. It gets answered in daylight, from 3 directions at once. So I built 2 identical packages, the deed chains, the link chart, Dolan's lowball appraisals, Doc's file, Todd's spreadsheet and emails, and the recording of set before the appraisal comes in. And I hand-delivered one to an investigative reporter at the regional paper who had been circling HOA abuse stories for a year, and the other to the financial crimes unit of the county district attorney, with a copy routed to the state attorney general's consumer protection division. And I timed all of it to land the same week as the association's annual meeting, because I wanted the neighbors who'd been told I was the problem to watch the problem turn out to be the man they'd elected to enforce the rules. The meeting is where the ring came apart, and it came apart fast. Gary Voss opened by asking the members to approve raising the fine schedule to protect community standards, still certain he had the room. Then I got the floor, which the chair could hardly deny in front of 40 people, and I didn't raise my voice. I put the link chart on the projector, 3 houses, 3 floods of fines, 1 appraiser, 1 LLC, 1 mailbox, and I let it sit there while people leaned forward to read it. I put up the 3 deeds with Cedar Hollow Holdings in every buyer's box. I put up Ray Dolan's appraisals side by side, each absurdly low, each feeding the same buyer. I put up the state filing that ran the LLC's ownership back through a nominee to Gary himself. I played 8 seconds of Gary saying the neighborhood sorts itself out, and then I read 1 line from Todd Kane. The number is set before the appraisal comes in. Doc Whitman stood up in the back. He'd driven 2 counties to be there, and told the room how he'd been fined out of his own home. And he wasn't alone. The Garrisons stood up beside him, and the Patels stood beside them. 3 families the board had sorted out, now standing shoulder to shoulder in the same room that had once chuckled at my fines. And the sound the crowd made was 40 people rearranging everything they'd believed about the man who ran their compliance committee. A phone went down 1 row, showing Todd's target list, addresses ranked by how close each owner was to breaking, and a woman 3 seats over found her own street number on it and went white. And Todd Kane, who had come to protect Meridian, stood and confirmed that the fines had been designed as leverage from the start. Somebody near the front said, "Fraud." Somebody else said, "The paper already has this." And when I told the room that both the district attorney and the attorney general had received the same file that morning, and that the story would run that weekend, Gary Voss finally understood that the neighborhood had, in fact, sorted itself out, just not the way he'd planned. It fell the way a rigged scaffold falls once you pull the key bolt. The story ran that weekend under a headline about a board member harvesting his neighbors' homes, and the district attorney's financial crimes unit, working with the attorney general, charged Gary Voss, Ray Dolan, and Todd Kane in connection with mail and wire fraud and bid rigging, because coordinating fines, appraisals, and a shell buyer to acquire property below value is not aggressive HOA governance, it's a criminal scheme, and no resignation makes that file disappear. Meridian Community Management lost the Cedar Hollow contract and most of its regional portfolio within a month, because a management company is only worth its fee until its manager is a cooperating witness. Board President Linda Price, who had signed the liens and looked away, resigned before the recall vote reached her. My fines and lien were voided outright. And the part I'm proudest of isn't mine at all. With the fraud exposed, the earlier sales became unwindable, and the Garrisons and the Patels and old Doc Whitman had a path to rescission, to getting back the homes and the money that had been taken from them, one fake fine at a time. I helped all three of them file, and I sat with them through the depositions where Cedar Hollow Holdings, stripped of its shell and its mailbox, had to answer for every dollar it had skimmed. The Patels moved back into their old bedrooms before the year was out. The Garrisons took a settlement instead and used it to close the chapter clean. Doc Whitman didn't want the house back at his age, but he wanted the check and the record set straight, and he got both. And he called me the day it cleared just to say that unlucky had finally been crossed off his list. Gary Voss had told a room full of his neighbors that Cedar Hollow sorts itself out, and in the end, it did. Right down to the very deed he would one day have to sign back. Author's note, stepping in for a minute, because this one isn't really about fines, it's about what fines become when a board points them at a target. Gary Voss's mistake was believing that if he never signed his own name to anything, the pattern would never connect back to him. But patterns don't need a signature. 3 floods of fines, 1 appraiser, 1 LLC, and 1 mailbox shared with the manager drew a straight line no shell company could break, and he handed over the motive himself, out loud, when he told a room the neighborhood sorts itself out. What actually sank the ring was ordinary, public paper. County deed chains are open to anyone. LLC filings are open to anyone. A registered agent address is one search. Gary counted on nobody bothering to look, and he ran that scheme straight into the one neighbor who does this for a living, and who kept a recording when the middleman admitted the price was set before the appraisal. Takeaways. Pull the deed chain when a run of voluntary sales follows a run of fines, because sales are public record. Watch for the same buyer and the same appraiser repeating. And know that fines aimed at forcing a distressed sale can be fraud, not enforcement, worth a call to your attorney general, not just a lawyer. Question for you. How many HOA problem owners who quietly sold and moved were actually harvested? Tell me below, and check who bought their house.